co-sponsors with the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Delighted my co-chair of the series, Joseph Pilat from the lab, could be with us today. I'll turn to him in a moment to introduce today's topic and speaker. Just wanted to briefly note that this series seeks to promote dialogue and exchange of information on important topical issues amongst policy community and to inform the public policy debate. We're delighted that Michael Levy can be with us today to discuss his new book on nuclear terrorism. Joe will tee up the issue and introduce the speaker, but I do note that as we're in a presidential season, that it's sort of the perennial, well, I guess, quadrennial question of like what's the greatest threat to the United States, and presidential candidates always seem to agree to be a nuclear weapon in the hands of a terrorist. So with that, let me turn over to Joe. The Center, again, is grateful for its collaboration with Los Alamos and very pleased that Joe could be with us today.
Thank you, Rob. Welcome, and welcome from the Los Alamos National Laboratory. As Rob was noting, the issue of nuclear terrorism is the one issue that united George W. Bush and John Kerry during the 2004 campaign. And last year, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Mueller, said that nuclear terrorism is one of the most dangerous and deadly threats we face. He's continued, few threats fall into the same class in terms of sheer devastation, damage, and loss. Few strike such fear in the hearts of the public, and few threats are so appealing to terrorists around the world for the same reasons. I think that Mueller was expressing what is, I think, unfortunately become the received wisdom about the nature of the threat. He was referring to the high end of the nuclear and radiological threat continuum, which also includes radiological or dirty bombs, as well as attacks or sabotage at nuclear facilities, and all those are important issues. People have focused on the issue of terrorism with nuclear weapons with yield, and that is what we're going to hear about today. I think we have a very fortunate we're very fortunate to have as our guest somebody who's really challenging some of the received wisdom about this threat. I think that Michael Levy, who is the Fellow for Science and Technology at the Council on Foreign Relations and had spent time at the Brookings Institution, as well as as the director of the Federation of American Scientists' flagship strategic security project, will talk about his thesis in his new book on nuclear terrorism. Michael?
Thank you. Thank you both for having me here. It's nice to see so many people and some familiar faces. It's always good when you're in exile up in New York to come back and see folks. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas in my new book and try to leave as much time as I can open to discussion, because the book isn't intended as the final word, as giving the solution to the challenge of nuclear terrorism, but instead it's, for the most part, intended as a guide for how to think about nuclear terrorism and how to use that as a way to think about how to improve defenses against it. So here's the basic starting point. If you want to think about how to prevent nuclear terrorism, you need to think through what nuclear terrorist plots might look like. And fortunately, we haven't seen any well-developed nuclear terrorist plots. The downside to that is that we don't have much to readily anchor ourselves with in reality when we do go about thinking through what plots might look like. So we tend to conjure up fantastic schemes, we obsess over worst-case scenarios, and as a counterpart, we demand perfect defenses. And that's dangerous. All of those pieces are dangerous. And in some sense, what I'm trying to do in this book is to help people kick the habit of falling into those different traps. I think back to something that the IRA said in a statement a little over 20 years ago. Just before 3 in the morning in early October 1984, a bomb planted by the IRA exploded at a hotel in Brighton, England. It missed killing Margaret Thatcher by about 3 minutes. She'd moved from one part of her hotel room to another and was lucky to escape. And the IRA issued a statement later that day. They said, "Today we were unlucky, but remember, we only have to be lucky once. You will have to be lucky always." It's a theme that we've heard over and over across the political spectrum. October 31st, 2006, President Bush, speaking in Perry, Georgia, said, "When it comes time to protecting the homeland, the United States of America must be right 100% of the time, and the enemy, which desires to strike us again, only has to be right once." Now, this is a true statement, whether this one or the claim by the IRA, from plot to plot. But when you dig inside a plot, it gets flipped on its head. A terrorist group needs to succeed in every part of their plot. And they don't just need to be able to succeed. They need to succeed. They need to be lucky in every part of their plot. We only need to be lucky once for them to fail. Let me give you an example from the nuclear world of what I mean. Same day that President Bush gave that speech, the GAO conducted a little test on the northern border. An SUV drove up to a remote point, not to a checkpoint, but to a remote part of the border. A man got out with a gym bag, walked across the border, handed it to an accomplice. Accomplice walked off with it undetected. Well, I shouldn't say undetected. Someone spotted them, reported it, but by the time anything happened, they were long gone. Inside the bag were 4 little canisters of weapons-grade uranium. And this is a fairly expert group, so I don't need to explain what the significance of that is. Now, the test was repeated 4 times. And 3 out of the 4 times, the group made it through. And out of the 4 times, they were actually stopped by Border Patrol officers. Well, a simple look at that is pretty scary. The consequences of a successful nuclear attack would almost certainly be devastating. And a 1 in 4 chance of stopping that doesn't sound very good. But what's essential is that we not isolate that one piece. Imagine that you had 10 different pieces, each like that, and you piled them on top of each other. Each of them would have a relatively small chance of stopping a plot, but together they'd make it so that the plot only had a 1 in 20 chance of succeeding. It's a very different sort of number. Now, you still need to be convinced that there might be that many pieces with that kind of likelihood of stopping a plot, but it's a very different picture. Why do we tend to dismiss these pieces? Because that's an important starting point. I think we intuitively dismiss these small chances of success, even if they can add up. It's something that's actually quite common when you look at how people think through different situations. People who study the psychology of economics find that we have difficulty with very small probabilities close to 0 and with big ones close to 1. We tend to round them off. So what we do is we take each of these, we say, well, given the consequences, this is pretty much useless, pretty much a 0 chance of it working. We move on to the next one, and we continually do that. And if we look at each piece by itself, we end up putting all these together and ending up with a 0 chance of stopping a terrorist plot. So we, in some sense, fool ourselves without thinking into dismissing these, the utility of these imperfect pieces of a defense. My favorite place where this comes up is in moral philosophy. Philosophers talk about something they call the lottery paradox, where they try to ask, why are people willing to do a lot of small bad things, but not one really big bad thing? And it's the exact same kind of psychological phenomenon that they point to. So that's one basic piece. You need to make sure you put all of the parts together before you dismiss any one of them. And that's a real bit of discipline to go out of your way. And it can sound kind of obvious, but look at a lot of analyses, and it's exactly what doesn't happen. There are 3 principles in this book that come together in that little vignette I was talking about. The first is that you need to look at defense as a system that's faced with a lot of different pieces. The second is we need to ground our understanding in reality as much as possible. Even that 25% figure is much higher than what a lot of people would suggest. You hear a lot of claims that it's trivial to go across a border between official crossing points without getting caught. Well, when you do tests, it's not necessarily so trivial. Things can go wrong and defenses can get lucky. And we need to move from asking for perfection to asking how we can improve defenses. Again, we'd still throw this out if we were focused only on perfection. I gave you a bit of an idea of what happens when you pile up a whole series of layers. And we often talk about something called a layered defense. I want to encourage people to move past that and think about defense as a system, which is a bit different from defense as a series of layers. When you think of defense as a series of layers, as a layered defense, what you're asking about each part of the defense is, what are the odds that it would stop a terrorist plot? How would it stop a terrorist plot? And that's what we just talked about at the border. When you think of defense as a system, what you're really asking is two things. You're asking, can this piece of a defense stop a plot? How would it? What are the odds? But you also want to ask, if it failed to stop a plot, how would it fail? And what I mean by that is, in the process of failing to stop a terrorist plot, a piece of a defense can still alter that plot. Okay? And think back again to the border. Let's say someone looked at those odds and said, I can more easily evade border security if I try to bring across a weapon in small pieces, in small parts, rather than something whole. Okay? That means that they can increase their chances of success at the border. It also means that they're more exposed to law enforcement once they're inside the United States. So in improving their odds against one part, they decrease their odds against another. And the same thing would happen in the opposite direction. They could decide to bring something in whole in order to avoid law enforcement, but they make themselves more vulnerable to the border. They'd also make themselves more vulnerable to intelligence activities and law enforcement elsewhere. So again, you have to look at it as a system, and each time, and this is another bit of discipline in doing analysis, each time you look at a piece of a defense and someone says, well, here is a way that a group could evade it, you also have to ask, what would the implications of that be for its vulnerability to the rest of the defense? And not just the existing defense, but what opportunities does that create for new approaches to defense more broadly, if we can put those pieces together. The second piece, and I find different people find different parts of this to be the punchline more than others. To me, this is what I find most interesting, is we need to ground things in experience and reality about terrorism, about things nuclear, but also from whatever experience we can carefully draw from. Like I said at the beginning, nuclear terrorism hasn't happened. It's easy to get carried away with our imaginations. And yes, nuclear is different. Okay, and we hear this all the time. Nuclear is different, so you can't learn so much from other experiences. There is a lot that we can draw from other areas. Actually brings me back very quickly, and I'll take a quick diversion to the beginning. We talked about honest-to-goodness nuclear versus dirty bombs. I said this is the reason this book focuses on honest-to-goodness nuclear, because the argument frequently is the kind of approach you're talking about, a system approach, whatever it is, makes sense in general for terrorism, but nuclear is different. It doesn't work for honest-to-goodness nuclear. And the only way to try to take that down is to really focus sharply on the honest-to-goodness mushroom cloud nuclear situation. Okay, bring things down to reality. The first part here is bring things to reality of how terrorist groups make, and terrorist group leaders make decisions. Okay? We often have a view of these groups sort of as automatons, especially from the world I come from, where we do technical analysis. We have a sort of intuitive idea of how terrorist groups work and how they make decisions that doesn't necessarily match up to a lot of reality. So first, a lot of the most capable terrorist groups, and I think this changes, at least for me, a lot of how I look at defenses. A lot of the most capable terrorist groups are also very averse to failure. Okay? Now, I'm not trying to say that there's any universal phenomenon here, but there are a lot of opportunities inherent in that. After September 11th, we got into this mentality where we said people aren't afraid of dying. That means that deterrence is dead. Okay? Well, against certain people within certain plots, the threat of retaliation is not nearly as useful as it once was. But the prospect of failure can be a lot more powerful, especially against leaders of these groups. And I'll give you a few reasons for why. The first is simply that that's the track record. When you look at people who study terrorism, and people in the nuclear world unfortunately don't tend to do that enough, when you look at studies of terrorism, that's the pattern that people find, that the most capable groups tend to be very averse to failure. There's a sort of theoretical, well, so there's a sociological explanation that Brian Jenkins has put out there, where he's argued that to fail for a lot of religious terrorist groups is really to be judged a failure in the eyes of God. And you could also look at it, it can be to be judged a failure in the eyes of your community. And that can be a heck of a lot of pressure in some cases. To me, I like a sort of theoretical explanation. There's a principle of natural selection at work to some degree. A group that constantly tries things and fails spectacularly has difficulty building up the kinds of capabilities that would be required for a sophisticated plot. And that's so if one of these reasons does something for you, then you really do need to think about defenses, imperfect defenses, being potentially far more powerful than you might otherwise think they are. Let me give you one very concrete implication of aversion to failure and a concrete manifestation of it. And it's that a lot of these groups are very conservative in how they operate. What does that mean? It means that while they'll be innovative, they like to avoid innovation as much as possible. They like to stick to their bread and butter tactics. They do not like uncertainty. Now, you look at the 9/11 plots as an example. And that's the example of immense creativity. A group thought of using airliners as missiles. It thought to use flight schools to train its operatives. But it also stuck to its bread and butter tactics wherever it could. One could have imagined sophisticated ways of, in theory, lowering the odds of getting caught moving people across borders. They didn't do that. They used forged documents or traditional visas and moved through legal crossings. They moved money the way they always had. So they didn't take advantage of every opportunity one could imagine. So again, when you come back to looking at nuclear terrorism and someone presents you a scenario, you can't automatically say there is a hole in the defense so people will take advantage of it. It does not always work that way. There's also, I think, a lot you can learn from structure of terrorist groups. And I'll just give you one example here. We've talked a lot since 9/11 about the transformation of al-Qaeda from a hierarchical group into a cellular network. And we can look at different kinds of terrorist groups. Some are cellular, some work as hierarchies, some are mixes. I'd argue that a hierarchical group is far more capable of pulling off a sophisticated nuclear plot than a cell-based group. We've tended to focus on the strengths of cell-based groups. They're very resilient. You kill one piece off and the rest survives. But there are a lot of moving parts in a nuclear plot, and as you get into more complicated plots, cell-based groups tend to be less effective for a variety of reasons. The biggest reasons is just very difficult to collect a diverse set of capabilities in any one cell if you don't have any central piece to plan things. If you have a large organization, you happen to have people scattered across it who can do operations, moving things around the world, who can do the right kind of recruiting with technical people, who can raise money, who can do the right transactions, and so on. And then you want to assemble them all in one place to pull off a plot. Still, that might be challenging, but it's something you could think through. If it's an individual cell that has to generate all those capabilities by itself, things become a lot harder. So there's an example of where the structure of the group intersects with what it's able to do. And that can lead to policy implications. It leads me at least to conclude that whatever things have been done wrong in Afghanistan, we could spend a long time talking about that, breaking al-Qaeda in particular into much smaller pieces has probably had a significant effect on lowering the odds of a successful nuclear attack. We also need to look at realism in the details. of plots, whether it's in the technical details or in operational details. So, for example, you might look at details of how a black market purchase would be pulled off. And I talk about this at length in the book, and I won't go into the fine details, but we know a lot about how different black market purchases might happen. And it's very hard to take any model of an existing black market and translate an existing successful black market and translate it into one for nuclear materials on the scale that would be needed for a nuclear plot. Yes, we see a lot of different trades in materials, and we may be missing a lot, but we may not be missing an enormous amount. We have to be careful in going to these conclusions. Whenever someone is stopped smuggling a small amount of weapons-grade uranium, there are two reactions. One is, this must just be the tip of the iceberg. And, well, that's actually the dominant reaction. But it's equally plausible to have the reaction, boy, we're really stopping things from happening. Usually, our reaction is just a confirmation of what we thought before the event happened. And if you want an example, take a look at one of the cover pieces in the current issue of The Atlantic. It talks about someone who's caught smuggling about 100 grams of weapons-grade uranium, claimed to have enormous amounts more. Normally, this man who had a history of an entire career of criminal behavior would not be the person we would trust on his word. But we tend to take him on his word when he tells us that something very scary is going to happen. Again, should we dismiss the possibility that we could have a real black market? Absolutely not. But we shouldn't assume it already exists, and we should think about ways to prevent it from emerging. The one analogy, I think, on black markets that's perhaps more interesting is an analogy to a black market in fine art. Why? There's something special about nuclear that's different from a lot of other black markets. When you have a drug market, if you want to create some kind of, or you want to deal with the fact that there's a lack of trust between partners, you just break it into a lot of little pieces. Okay? We'd always talk about how there's a fantastically successful black market in drugs, so why couldn't there be in nuclear things? In the black market for drugs, you find that people don't tend to do large transactions with folks that they don't know well, that they don't trust in advance. They stay under about $10,000. Once they get bigger, they deal with people they already know. The problem is you can't do that kind of breakdown all that effectively when it comes to nuclear weapons or nuclear materials, because half enough material for a nuclear bomb is worth a heck of a lot less than enough material for a whole nuclear bomb. And it is kind of like fine art. Half of a painting is not worth so much. Okay? And you find actually that in the antiquities world, in the art world, there isn't all that much of this sort of black market in the sense we think there's a lot of there are a lot of thefts, commission thefts. In the antiquities market, they've actually taken to breaking intact pieces so that they can sell them off in parts, but again on order, and they'll sell them off over a period of time. So again, that's just one idea of getting it into the guts of things. And that's a lot of what this is about, I should say, so I won't do it over and over. But I want to give you a feel. It is important to get into the guts of these things, into details. A very important area where we can get a lot of realism is in non-nuclear parts of a plot. And there are two important reasons. One is we have experience, so we can learn a lot of lessons. But the other is to the extent that we understand non-nuclear elements, we have more experience on the defensive side also, and potentially more tools to make use of. So, for example, when we look at border crossings, we tend to do a lot of calculations about how effective radiation detectors might be. And I do a bunch of that in the book. But odds are you're just as likely to stop a nuclear smuggler by stopping the smuggler, detecting the smuggler, as you are by detecting what's nuclear. And you look at the case of Ahmed Rassam, who tried to bring explosive materials, not nuclear, but traditional explosives, into the United States to blow up a bomb at the Los Angeles airport at the turn of the millennium. And he was stopped. Now, people saw him acting suspiciously as he got onto a ferry in Canada, but didn't stop him. Then they saw him acting suspiciously again as he got off a ferry in Washington State, and they did stop him. Now, they had no clue that there was anything to do with explosives going on. I mean, dangerously so. They actually shook things in his trunk that contained nitroglycerin. So not so smart. But they still stopped the plot. Okay? They still stopped it, and eventually they were able to figure out what was in that trunk. You might find a similar phenomenon with nuclear smuggling. We may be more likely to detect people because they're acting nervously. And if that's the case, we want to think about technical tools that we would use after having had some indication that something wrong was going on, rather than tools that simply operate all by themselves and are supposed to solve the entire smuggling problem by themselves. And again, in a discussion, we can get more into detail about what the specifics of that sort of thing might actually be. There's a nuclear case relatively recently that really emphasizes this for me, and that's this Slovakian smuggling case from late last year. The deputy head of Slovakian police went out, made this big announcement that they had stopped a plot to sell, I believe it was roughly a kilogram of very highly enriched uranium powder. They said 98.6% enriched uranium. Okay, that's scary stuff. Then he says, and this would make a deadly dirty bomb. Now, those of you who are familiar with radiological weapons know that uranium is pretty useless in a dirty bomb. Lead is more effective. The other thing on top of that is when they published pictures of the radiation detector showing this 98.6%, one of your former colleagues, one of my former colleagues, showed this picture on a website, and you look at it and it says basically that it's 98.6% confident that the stuff is totally useless. Okay? It's 98.6% confident that there's very little uranium-235 in it. Okay, so what are the two things from here? Obviously, these guys had no sophistication when it came to anything nuclear. They didn't understand about dirty bombs. They didn't understand how to use the detectors. But they stopped the plot. They stopped this effort quite successfully, okay? Despite not having that skill. That says something. All they really needed to know in that case was that uranium was probably a bad thing, and they should do something about it, okay? Now, if we took that sort of situation and then built on it by training people in those sorts of positions to have more knowledge on the nuclear side, that's a very cost-effective way of improving defenses against nuclear terrorism. I always like to talk about a couple pet peeves of mine in analysis. The one that always gets to me is when people talk about how the barriers to building nuclear bombs have fallen because there's so much information out there. There is a lot of information out there. Some of it's really bad. It might be good policy to publish more bad information on purpose. Some of it's good, unfortunately. But the really important part is that information is the relatively easy part. When it comes to making a nuclear weapon, design is the relatively easy part. Again, this is a simple thing, but engineering is harder, and harder than engineering really is the nitty-gritty technical stuff. Yes, it can be done. A group could have the right people. You do not need Manhattan Project style things, let alone modern nuclear capabilities, but there are a lot of different ways that things can go wrong. For example, the Iraqi effort to cast uranium never managed to do it properly without getting a lot of the impurities out of the material. And this is the sort of thing that even if we always say, well, a state has higher demands. If a terrorist group couldn't overcome that particular barrier, they could make a bomb if they got through the other steps of a plot, but the yield would be not half or 10 times lower, but maybe 100 or 1,000 times lower. Still a horrible day, but it is a big difference. The difference between 100,000 people killed and 5,000 people killed is a real difference. It also, he says, we draw some incorrect lessons from one of the most famous episodes that we like to look at, which is the Nth Country experiment, where postdocs with technical skills but without exposure to nuclear weapons were asked to design a bomb and successfully design an implosion bomb several decades ago. And that's taken again as strong evidence that the barriers are relatively low. Again, that group didn't have to build anything. Not only did it not build anything, but if it had an experiment it wanted to do to understand design better, it just delegated it to a team of very skilled, experienced people. If it wanted programming to be done, it delegated it. Okay? Important not to learn too much from experience, just as it's important to try to draw from a wide variety of experiences. The last pet peeve I'll throw out there is we need to be very careful to avoid the logic that says if a terrorist group can do the following difficult thing, then they can do the following easy thing. Okay? If they can get nuclear materials, then they can hire scientists and engineers and build a bomb. If they can build a bomb, they can move it across borders. In theory, yes, one is easier than the other, but you have a couple different problems here. One is that different tasks require different skills. Okay? There may be a group that's very good at one thing and simply not good at the other. People will say, what happens if a group of Pakistani scientists and engineers in a physics lounge decide that they're very upset at America and they're going to pull off a nuclear attack? Well, that's something we should be concerned about, but we still should ask, where does that group not only have a capability to get materials or move things around the world, but what are even their connections to start to get the right people to go in that direction? Maybe they could find them. Maybe they would run into stings. Maybe they would run into difficulties. There may also be a group of thugs that is very good at stealing things, but that isn't very good at doing much else and doesn't necessarily have connections, let's say in the technical world or internationally. People will say, well, if you have money, you can buy anything. But again, it doesn't always happen. You look at the example of Shinrikyo, not in its sarin attack attempts, but in its anthrax attack attempts. And it failed pretty miserably in its attempts to use anthrax. And what's particularly striking is that it had decent connections in the former Soviet bioweapons world. And it never drew on them, because this was a very ambitious plot, and it was scared of bringing anyone outside the very core inside and being exposed because of that. Again, just because there was an opportunity to draw in extra skills and extra capabilities does not mean it was exploited. You can look at the 9/11 plots, and there's actually a slightly more ambitious approach there. Al-Qaeda was willing to bring in people who were already trained as pilots who had a history with the cause from the 1980s, but weren't hardcore members at the time. But they weren't willing to go as far as actually going out and trying to actively find pilots. So again, there are different degrees of how risky groups are willing to be in drawing folks in. The other reason that the logic doesn't always work is that mistakes happen. Okay? And mistakes don't just happen in hard things. They happen in easy things. Often they happen more in easy things because that's when you let your guard up against mistakes happening. And you can look at the example of these, I used to say British doctors until someone corrected me, British employees of the National Health Service who, a couple were doctors, I think one was an engineer, attempted to blow up these bombs in front of a nightclub in London. Well, firstly, they were fairly sophisticated but didn't manage to make the bombs properly. But the plot really was uncovered when their car was spotted in what they call a double yellow and no parking zone in front of the nightclub, and come to be towed away, and that's when they discovered the bombs. Okay? Now, if I apply the previous logic, if you're smart enough to get a medical degree, you wouldn't leave your car with the bombs in a no parking zone. I would have said that could never happen. Again, am I trying to argue that these sorts of things will inevitably happen? No, but we need to anticipate ways that people can make dumb mistakes and be ready to capitalize on them. So this doesn't necessarily just deliver things for us right away, but we need to be aware of them. And you can look at this in the case of the attempt to blow up several airliners over the Pacific in the mid-1990s, which was brought down by a spontaneous fire in the apartment of a couple people working on a bomb in Manila, and led to the unraveling of a plot. And you can look at a nuclear analogy to that. If someone was machining uranium and the dust spontaneously caught fire, which happens, you could find something similar to that if a group didn't have the right kind of sanctuary. Let me close with by preempting a question that I get asked. I won't go into a list of policy recommendations right now. Most policy recommendations come in the form of putting this kind of thinking into the process of making policy rather than very specific policies, but I can talk about that in the discussion. Let me preempt the question, though, of how likely is a nuclear terrorist attack? And if you take this kind of approach, how much can a broad defense reduce the odds of a successful attack? Well, it's not a question you can really answer. There have been a lot of answers put out there. I've heard better than even chance in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. You hear the same prediction each year. I've heard 20% a year. 6% in the next 10 years. These are all from people that I respect enormously, who've done very careful work in a wide variety of areas, but often feel compelled to then put a number on things. The number really obscures things. What's more important is to really understand the details, to understand why you come to a particular conclusion about the odds of an attack, because that helps you identify ways to lower it. And so when I come into answering this question of how likely is an attack, I end up putting people in three basic categories. We call them nuclear zealots, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, just descriptive. Zealots would say, well, there's basically close to 100% chance of an attack happening. They'll either follow by saying it's useless or I've got a solution for you. You have the nuclear atheists who will say, well, zero or pretty close to zero. Stop worrying about it so much. And I encourage people to end up in a third category, the pragmatic agnostics. Okay, agnostic because you're not so sure what the odds are of an attack, probably not as close to 100% of the zealots, but you don't want to dismiss it. Like the atheists, you want to be a bit careful. And pragmatic because you want to use the way you come to that conclusion to improve defenses. And that comes to my last point, which is there's a bit of a fear out there in a lot of the policy community. I think that if you make an argument that suggests that nuclear terrorism may be less likely than you think or harder than you think, that somehow it will lead us to do less to prevent it, and that we need to keep up the concern in order to get people to do more. There's a real unfortunate possibility that if you overestimate the ease of pulling off an attack, you will do less to prevent it because you'll miss opportunities for where defenses could be effective. And I think of a policeman who gets up in the morning and says, some of the bad guys have armor-piercing bullets, so I'm not going to wear my bulletproof vest. I'm going to make sure I'm as light and agile as possible today so I can just avoid these guys. And he goes out and he gets trapped in a situation. He can't avoid someone. They have a normal, non-armor-piercing bullet. He gets shot. He gets killed. He has missed a defensive opportunity not because he underestimated the threat, but because he overestimated the threat. And we need to be careful that we don't do the same thing when it comes to nuclear terrorism, because the consequences are so grave that we need to do whatever's possible to prevent an attack.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I think we've seen the elements of an alternate way of thinking about this issue, and I presume that there's going to be some questions. Yes, we'll start with you.
Hi. Jerry Olick, retired intelligence analyst, Sovietologist. I agree with you that this threat is overestimated, and the cascading analysis that is weak on detecting is probably an error. So I start with that. But when I saw that you were going to do this presentation coming over here, I thought of two cases where terrorists wouldn't have to fabricate and weaponize nuclear weapon. They would get a hold of a nuclear device. And the two that come to mind is the way of bringing them into the country is on container ships, a ready assembled device, and even the more dangerous one, and I'd like your opinion on this one, is the old suitcase independent device that would be able to be transported by a single individual. We had information years ago that there were such devices in the Soviet Union that were not all acquired or knowledge of. So that kind of scenario where somebody just has to carry a suitcase into the country, no network, nothing, and take the device to some place where if you explode a 10 KT weapon, you don't have to be on target. So your opinion on that?
Well, I'll address directly in a second, but it also gives me an opportunity to make an important point, which is that when you assess any particular approach to defense, and you should be looking at how it improves defense, not just at where the holes are. That doesn't mean you shouldn't look for the holes, and I'll talk about those holes in a second. But you should be looking for opportunities just as much. The only time you should only focus on holes is if you have a perfect alternative. Okay, if you don't have a perfect alternative, then holes aren't all it. So I'd start by saying that these would probably be considerably tougher cases for a defense, and that means that some of the things you would do as a defense probably shouldn't be geared to these particular kinds of cases. The whole container business, let me just make a few comments about that. The first is, yes, there has been an overemphasis on containers, but amongst legal crossings, there is an advantage to containers over a lot of other ones that we should probably be a bit concerned about, which is that a person doesn't need to accompany the device. Okay? Now, if one of the big ways of detecting a smuggling effort is detecting the smuggler, container shipping takes that out of the equation. Okay? So that's one reason that a group may prefer to use that route. The second piece I'd say on containers is that there are a lot of things that you can detect. We tend to focus on the absolute hardest thing to detect, and we say detection is useless on containers because if you have a small amount of well-shielded, pure weapons-grade uranium metal, we don't usually parse it quite like that, but that is what we're talking about. You can't detect it. I go through a bit of this at an accessible level, and then in the endnotes at an inaccessible level. Some of the details on what the variety of detection challenges are there. So again, it's not as completely hopeless as one might imagine. All that said, I think that the effort to have 100% container screening is a bit crazy. I shouldn't say a bit. It's complete overkill for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's not really 100% screening anyhow. Okay, the 100% screening with moderately effective detection is not 100% screening. It's just detection at 100% of containers. The other is if you can't get perfection, you want to affect deterrence, and that's a lot more cost effective. So you probably need a much lower level of detection to pull that off. Now, what is that level? I don't know, and I think there's some interesting thinking inside government going on and actually trying to figure out how much do you need to deter. But that's my other little comment on containers. As far as the suitcase-style bombs go, again, at least at the public level, there's not a huge amount of knowledge of these things. My basic understanding is that to the extent that anything quite small existed, a lot of the parts have degraded considerably. Do you want a microphone?
Yes, being webcast.
It is. A lot of the parts.
Web archived anyway. So.
A lot of the parts have potentially been degraded. Again, that doesn't mean that the bomb doesn't go off, but it means the explosive power is likely to be a lot lower. Again, you wouldn't want to dismiss that, but there's a difference. And there's also, what you made an interesting point of, you don't need to be right on target. But the need to be right on target does, or close to target, increases quite quickly as the yield of a weapon goes down. There's a synergy between lowering the yield and displacing the detonation. Again, do I want to see a nuclear bomb go off? Absolutely not. But you do have to consider varieties of consequences. And the last part on whether there are these ones that aren't accounted for, again, that's something to worry about. But we should also be cautious. There are two reasons that things can be unaccounted for. One is that they're gone. The other is that the Soviet Union didn't do a fantastic job of accounting. So we just have to be, again, not to be Pollyannish, but also not to be too fatalistic. Thank you.
Questions? Yes. Please identify yourself and your organization.
Howard Moreland, a private citizen, I'm actually working with the Methodist Council on Bishops on Nuclear Weapons. Everything you said, I think, is very useful in regard to general defense against terrorism of all types. But the most serious efforts to prevent nuclear terrorism seem to have always focused on the question of keeping track of fissile material. And it seems to me that fissile material that's bomb-grade uranium-235 plutonium is essential for any nuclear weapon, but it's not actually necessary for any other activity of industrial civilization. And it seems to me that if you really want to prevent nuclear terrorism, you should have a global ban on the existence of fissile material. And it's not good for anything except nuclear weapons, and anybody who has a nuclear weapon is a nuclear terrorist, including the United States government. If we don't want nuclear terrorism, we can ban fissile material, period. And I try to imagine what the world's like in 500 years. I can't imagine that there'll be 9 nations with nuclear arsenals in 500 years. It seems like we're either going to get rid of nuclear weapons altogether or get rid of ourselves, one or the other, in the long run.
And this is an entirely broader question to get at, but why don't I make some comments specifically on the role of controlling and reducing stocks of fissile materials. I didn't emphasize it in my talk at all, but in the book I emphasize the centrality of that to an effective defense against nuclear terrorism for 2 reasons. One, which is the traditional argument, which is correct, which is if you don't have the stuff, you can't pull off a nuclear attack. The other is that the more effective and the stronger your controls, both over existing materials and over proliferation, the more effective the rest of your defense is going to be. And here's why. When your security fails to control weapons or materials, again, like I said earlier on, it can fail in different ways. The tighter your security is, the more opportunistic terrorist groups are going to have to be. The more chance they may end up with something other than your weapons-grade uranium metal perfectly formed for them in advance or whatnot, which introduces in turn more opportunities for defense, whether it's in detection of smuggling or in spotting people recruiting or working on a weapon or whatnot. It also means there's a higher chance you will get an alarm of someone trying to steal something. When it comes to the spread of nuclear weapons, the fewer countries have weapons, the more easy it is to attribute an attack. We could go into that in a lot of detail. But the easier it is to attribute an attack, the less likely it is that a state will let something get into the hands of a group or give it to a group. Now, in the big, broader picture, we could get into a long discussion of, do you want to get rid of nuclear materials? Do you want to get rid of nuclear weapons? It doesn't strike me as a practical, near-term sort of thing to be doing, even though it's a direction that's generally good to be heading in. So in the meantime, we still have to sort of figure out the next best ways of doing things.
Yes.
I'm Ben Tenenbaum from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I'm sort of hearing in what you're saying that we're either addressing the wrong problems or at least the wrong part of the problem. So I wanted to get your thoughts on 2 somewhat distinct issues. Earlier this week, there was a hearing on the Senate side where Senator Dianne Feinstein grilled the director of the FBI fairly seriously on whether or not he, as director of the FBI, felt that his resources were being focused in the right direction. Namely, are we missing other sorts of activities that could be dangerous to the United States by focusing so seriously on nuclear terrorism? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Secondly, your home city, New York, has some legislation before it that would require the registration of all detectors, whether they're detecting radiation or biological devices or what have you, with the police department. Is this another example of overkill where you're trying to address a problem by taking out useful tools from anyone who could possibly want them?
Ben, the premise, just because I didn't follow the hearing, the premise of her question was that the FBI was already focusing too much on nuclear terrorism?
They were resource limited.
And that they were focusing too much attention there.
Essentially.
See, I don't get the impression they're focusing a huge amount of attention on the nuclear threat specifically. I do think in general that to the extent you can, you want to be focusing on things that cut across a variety of threats. That's why these non-nuclear tools are so important. It's another reason also why you can't do a straight-up cost-benefit analysis on some of these things, because with these non-nuclear specific elements of a defense, you have payoffs across a wide range of dimensions, not just across nuclear. So in general, my philosophy for things like law enforcement agencies is that you want to strengthen the basic capabilities that apply across the board and then think of the sort of ornaments, the little pieces you add on to make them even more effective against the nuclear threat, rather than having a nuclear strategy and an everything else strategy, which often is what ends up happening. Registering all detectors in New York City. I'll start by saying New York City Police Department is probably the most sophisticated of any police department in the country in dealing with WMD and nuclear in particular, in part because its head of counterterrorism actually really knows something about nuclear, knows a lot about nuclear issues. I wrote one of the best books on covert WMD terrorism. Do you want to make everyone register all detectors in New York City? I mean, I guess it depends on what you do at that point. There are a lot of things that you have to register. It doesn't strike me as a terrible thing in principle. Now, if when people go to register it, you're going to say university departments can't have radiation detection equipment anymore, then it becomes more difficult. But I guess I'm not quite sure what the enormous problem is with registering detection equipment. It's not hugely widespread in individual use, as best as I can tell. None of my friends have any detectors with them. I'll ask this weekend.
Well, I mean, we can talk about this more afterwards, but it's not just radiation sensors. It's environmental sensors. It's a whole host of different technologies.
Okay.
And the question is,
Well, you have to craft it carefully if you want to have a machine to make sure that your house doesn't have too high a level of pollens in it or something because you're incredibly allergic. This could get really messy.
It's also looking at environmental sampling of the East River to see why the fish are dying or why the fish are coming back. But I mean, should the police department be licensing the use of detectors? Do they not have other things that they'd be better served, or the population of New York would be better served to have them do?
It's a broader question. I don't know. Things in Manhattan are pretty safe these days.
Jonathan.
John Medallia with Congressional Research Service. A couple of points. First of all, following up on what the first gentleman said about the suitcase bomb, I think that just by the dimensions and the weight of it, it seems most unlikely that you could get 10 kilotons out of that. And so that's an example of what you were talking about earlier, Michael, where if you're forced to do one kind of thing, it affects the outcome. And also what Joe was talking about, where over time the whatever materials, be they nuclear materials or plastic or what have you, might be less effective. The second point, I did find your overall analysis very interesting and useful, but I guess the question is, most people would feel that the odds of a nuclear terrorist attack are somewhere greater than zero, but somewhat less than 100%. And so, that leaves a lot of agnostics, as you call them. And so, what policy prescriptions does your analysis lead to?
Thank you. That wasn't a setup. I didn't tell you to say that. Let me give you a few ideas of policy things. Let me give you a few narrow examples and then a few broader ones. I mean, one narrow example is the sort of things I was talking about when it came to container security. Again, that comes from both the not focusing on perfection, but also focusing on what you can do rather than just on where the gaps are. There were those two other basic things. One is defense as a system. How do you put that into practice? There are a few different ways you want to look at putting that into practice. A lot of people talk about having a czar to run the show. If a lot of this big picture system defense against nuclear terrorism is non-nuclear, that pretty much throws that idea out the window as a universal kind of czar, because that czar would have to control the entire national security apparatus plus more, which isn't going to happen and shouldn't happen. Now, you could have someone responsible for all the nuclear-specific elements, but that's different. And you have other attempts, top-down attempts in some sense, to coordinate things, whether it's Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, for example. But again, it's restricted to a piece of the problem. You can have sort of different kinds of what I'd call soft coordination, which I think you need to look at. So one simple thing is you need to have the counterterrorism and the counterproliferation or nuclear types talking to each other regularly. Again, sounds kind of obvious. In the WMD Commission report, they talked about how the analysis of WMD, al-Qaeda WMD activities in Afghanistan pre-9/11, you had, not on the collection side or on the analysis, just on the theoretical understanding, the al-Qaeda specialists, the Afghanistan specialists, and the WMD specialists never talk to each other. Okay, so simple sorts of things to bridge that. You have a lot more contact between the relevant people at the Homeland Security and National Security Councils than you used to, even a few years ago. That's real progress. Again, things you would think would obviously happen weren't necessarily happening. You want to, I think, take a look at something, the National Plan to Combat Terrorist Travel that the National Counterterrorism Center produced a few years ago. And they published a very detailed public version. And what it did is it took the problem of combating terrorist travel. It wasn't something that you could put someone responsible for top down and run the show and coordinate all the pieces. So it did the next best thing, which was explain to everyone how the pieces would fit together so that they could do it themselves. And it took this single goal of combating terrorist travel, it broke into 3 different pillars, each of which got broken down into more pieces. And you got 5 layers down into 60 different programs. And that lets you see how the different pieces fit together. And it makes it harder to pick out any one piece and say this isn't going to solve the problem. It also is a bit of a directory. You can't coordinate with other people if you don't know they exist or you don't know they're doing anything relevant to your problem. So simple things like that can promote cooperation and coordination without having to actually have some master hand guiding the whole thing. The other side of this sort of, and it comes up also in another part, is you want to test systems as systems to a good degree and exercise them as systems. What I mean by that is, yes, it's useful to do audits and tests of little pieces of the defense as long as you make sure to learn from that what you can learn from that. But there's a tendency to focus just on any one piece and show how you can defeat it. And that's Congress likes to commission these things a lot. And no ill intent to my friends from Congress here. You have to be careful about those. Those are useful as long as you interpret them right. But it's also very important to put those pieces together and try to do broad exercising as much as you can. My understanding is there is going to be an international joint end-to-end exercise sometime not so far in the distant future. And that could be very interesting and useful. I should say those exercises also serve this kind of soft coordination approach by building the networks amongst people who need to cooperate, yet again. And this other part is grounding things in reality as much as possible. And to me, that means having a very careful, detailed intelligence assessment on these things that doesn't just look at the broad motivations and at the broad possibilities, but really looks carefully at the finer details of where things could go wrong, even if they're low odds. And again, obviously, I don't have access to that sort of thing, but given the response I've gotten from people who do, to get a very simple idea, my suspicion is that it's needed. And what you want to have is you want to make sure you don't just have the usual nuclear terrorism crowd producing this kind of assessment. There's a lot of ingrained thinking. And you want to make sure you bridge nuclear and terrorism, but you also want to bring in people from outside and draw on them. So, for example, if you want to understand smuggling across the border, you need to do a lot more work with the DEA, because they know that a heck of a lot better than the Department of Energy or the CIA does. And that kind of thing is, as I understand, that sort of thing is happening more, but it's not necessarily happening nearly as much as it should. So again, on the intelligence assessment side, you need to bring in as broad a range of things as possible. I'll give you one other overarching piece that's difficult and that I'd say I'm sort of partway through, but not all the way through. You need to think a lot more about how you share information. And I don't just mean that in the sense that we talked about after 9/11 about different pieces of the federal government didn't share enough information with each other. Well, that's part of it. But you have much harder questions here. And I'll just give 3 of them. Firstly, you need to think about the value of sharing information with international partners to the extent that your system is international. You need to think a lot more about sharing information with state and local folks than you do now. And there's a bit of an irrational approach in the nuclear world because we have the default where it's very hard to share anything nuclear relevant. That's based on an underlying assumption that if you can keep something secret, it's better to have it be secret. That's not obviously true. Information has values in different value in different ways that you use it. And I think we need to be much more deliberate about how we use that kind of secret nuclear information. You want to make sure that a police officer that goes into a home on a drug raid and there happens to be some work going on, some low-level work, something related to nuclear terrorism, might have a chance of actually recognizing it. And you can't do that if you don't teach them properly. You want to be able to motivate local-level people to care about these things. You can't do that if you can only get the most cursory threat assessment out to them. So you have to think carefully about that. And then there's the even harder part, which is you need to think about what information you want to share with your enemies. Because if part of this is about deterrence, the doomsday machine doesn't work if no one knows that it exists. Well, deterrence doesn't work against terrorism if you don't communicate something to terrorist groups. And that involves not only deciding what you're comfortable sharing, but figuring out how to communicate this stuff. This is not obvious, and it's not necessarily so easy to do that. How do you communicate with groups? How do you communicate with enablers? I mean, again, you probably have to work with other pieces of government that are better at these things. How do you communicate with other governments that might provide materials to a terrorist group to convince them that you might be able to attribute something but not show them how to spoof you? So there's a lot of information issues here and a lot of secrecy issues that I think are tough and that need a real deliberate review. So those are a few broad policy ideas that sort of come back into implementing this. But again, you don't get a three-point plan if you're that. In some sense, that automatically kills the idea of having a very broad defense where you got a lot of different pinpricks that add up.
Rob.
Just wanted to offer a comment and then lead into a question. Thank you, Michael, for your presentation. I think that your analysis sheds light on the issue and provides a kind of reality check to a lot of the assertions that are made out in the open literature. Your synthesis between the thesis and antithesis of nuclear zealotry and nuclear atheism, I think really lands you much closer to the nuclear atheist than to the zealots. I mean, and that's a classic deterrent formulation of low probability event with high consequences.
Yes.
We need to hedge. We've heard
Agnostics are usually closer to the atheist than to the zealots.
I think that so the metaphor definitely works, and we've heard assertions in this room that kind of the Thomas Jefferson High School physics class and all kinds of non-state actors. All you need is just a special nuclear material. You slap it together, and you get an explosion. I mean, we just saw what happened with a state that was using presumably the implosion method with a plutonium-based program in North Korea, come up with a kiloton, sub-kiloton blast, and question about whether it was very sophisticated or it was a dud. I think people think that it was, they're on a learning curve. And the notion, essentially, that superhuman qualities are ascribed to the non-state actors. There was an article in Scientific American saying that reactor security was lax because terrorists might grab a reactor, extract material, and on spec kind of make a bomb and then explode it. I mean, which talk about superhuman attributes. The two routes that have been that are there for terrorist acquisition are leakage and transfer, and this relates to the distinction in the literature of the two forms of deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment, which I'm sure you get into in the book, and you kind of were going through it quickly here. But as you look at it, the scenario that dominates our thinking, the transfer, the handoff of from Iran or North Korea of a nuclear weapon to a terrorist group, seems to be the least likely and the most deterrable of the routes. I mean, it depends on developments on attribution technology, et cetera. But could you focus on the leakage side of it? The leakage could either be materials, and you've laid out how difficult it would be for a terrorist group just with materials to put it together. But what about weapons diversion? And here, the two culprits are usually kind of Russia with these the mythic 100 suitcase bombs missing, or the Al-Qaeda cell operating inside the Pakistan nuclear establishment.
And you want that in the context of deterrence.
Or just in terms
because there's some interesting things to talk about in that context.
Well, it could either be it's a deterrent issue, but also what
can we do?
Deterrence by denial may mean working with the Pakistanis on things like PALs, which run us up against NPT obligations not to transfer nuclear technology to a non-signatory state. There may be some things we could do with deterrence by punishment, which is problematic with Pakistan and quadruply problematic when it comes to Russia. But just sort of, could you just give us your take on those issues?
Sure. On transfer, I agree that it's, I don't know the least likely because I don't know which is likely, but states are probably going to be deterred by, you don't have to have anything close to certainty of retaliation. You just need to have a significant prospect of something happening. Now, I'll say it's more complicated than just sorting out attribution, even though that is hard enough in itself. And I hope you'll have the folks who did the AAAS report on the recent report come and speak about that. But what I'll say is, just to ally the technical stuff, which is hard enough by itself, I don't think we thought through the strategic side of that carefully enough. And here, what you've got is all the complications involved in Cold War deterrence, plus this element of uncertainty about whether a transfer is intentional or unintentional. And that adds a bit of a mess into the strategic side. So imagine the situation. Bomb explodes in New York City, attributed 100% certainty to North Korea. The United States retaliates against North Korea. Turns out that it was a senior general acting out of line that let it go. Now you've provoked North Korea to retaliate back against you because you've hit them when they weren't planning on conducting any more attacks in the first place. So you got to be careful about those sorts of things and about how much that hurts your credibility if your threat in the first place. Threat and then threat.
Dr. Strangelove, they said, don't knock the whole program because of one slip up. So
you. I'm not talking about it from an ethical standpoint, which is a separate issue, which is an important issue, but just simply from a sensibility standpoint, you don't want to provoke people to do things that they wouldn't have done. And in that context, I find threatening countries for to essentially to hold them accountable for not being sufficiently vigilant in controlling their materials is an extraordinarily counterproductive approach to things. Here's a pretty simple reason. Let's say you did that with Russia. Imagine that you decided that you wanted to make that kind of threat, or with Pakistan or whoever. So if we can attribute it to you, we're going to hit you. And we're going to attribute it to you. And so, by the way, in order to strengthen our attribution capabilities, we'd like to create a database of all the materials in the world so that we can do the attribution. Now, what are the odds that they're going to offer up their materials for that database? Okay, so let's say you say, oh, okay, we're not going to make you put in the database. We'd get it after the fact. But what we want to do is we want to cooperate with you in securing your stuff so it doesn't get out there in the first place. Let's let our guys come in and take a look. But we're not going to take any samples while we're there. Be confident. So you probably end up with a situation where you make it less likely that you'll get the access you need to prevent what it is you're trying to deter. Okay? So again, probably quite counterproductive. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think that this sort of attribution and forensic stuff isn't extremely important, but it's probably more important for preventing the second attack than it is for restoring the grand Cold War wonder of deterrence. On Russia and Pakistan, and you can spend forever, and I'm sure you've had people here spend forever on what to do about Russia. There are all sorts of different programs that you can do and more political heavy lifting to remove barriers and so on. One thing I'd say is what I find it interesting that we haven't, as far as we know, seen any large-scale thefts. And it's a tricky thing to explain because we hear legitimately about all these situations with quite poor security. And you do have to ask, if we apply the same logic that a lot of people apply to the balance of the terrorist plot, where if there's an opportunity, a group takes advantage of it. If you applied that to security for materials and stocks of materials in Russia, the stuff would have been gone ages ago. I mean, there are plenty of opportunities that are easy to identify. So it suggests, to some degree, that groups are looking at the balance of what it takes and saying, maybe it's not worth mounting a big effort on the first step if we might not be able to get through the rest. Now, that could be proven wrong tomorrow. And there are groups that have looked at these sorts of things seriously. But you haven't seen any really massive attempts as best I know. So that's my quick comment on Russia. On Pakistan, again, as you say, it gets to a much deeper issue. And you sort of have the battle of the technical people who identify technical solution like PALS, and then the sort of lawyers who will try to see how it violates the NPT. Someone said to me when I talked about this particular issue somewhere else that the treaty says what the treaty says. And what his point was is you figure out what you want it to say. The problem is we already have an established understanding of what it says, and it pretty much says you're not allowed to transfer something like PALS. I would argue for a deliberate effort to reinterpret things to allow those sorts of transfers. I would not just sort of do it flying in the face of the treaty, but you would want an international effort to reinterpret and see if you could do that. All that said, I don't know if you'd get the Pakistanis to cooperate. I mean, my understanding is, the biggest problem so far may simply be the Pakistanis think you're going to give them a self-destruct mechanism to put inside all their bombs, or a remote destruct, or whatever it is, and they're not going to let you anywhere near them. So you have to think about that. Are they going to take this thing in the first place?
Harry Blaney.
You have to, right here.
Harry Blaney. Harry Blaney. Once in my sins, I had a hat which was to be the staff director of something called the NSC Contingency Planning Group in the 1970s, which dealt with mass destruction terrorism. And the only comment I'll make about it is the first effort was to get the agencies to talk to each other and cooperate with each other, which turned out to be impossible. And we found a solution of giving this problem, if you will, this suitcase bomb to DOD. I have no idea what they did with it, but we haven't yet had to worry about it so far in terms of anything going off. I'm going to make a macro kind of policy thought here to make this thing a little controversial. And in one way, I agree with you on the short term that the chances are low, but I think that over the long term, for your children and your children's children, the chances are exceedingly high. And in that context, the discussion later on about trying to get rid of this material and really putting global controls on it and dealing with it in a more comprehensive way gets more and more attractive as a policy option for the country. And the sooner, the saying goes, the better, because it's immensely a complicated process. It requires an awful lot of political will. It's interesting this meeting takes place today because yesterday I went to another meeting over at the U.S. Institute of Peace about the banning of nuclear weapons, which I thought was very worthwhile and in very way relevant to this discussion. So that's my first macro comment. And the real question I have is to ask our speaker, which I appreciate very much his presentation, what you think is the best way to engineer that macro, if you would, trajectory that would bring us closer in the long run to a more zero-sum in this. I say closer because I don't believe you can ever do it entirely. But and more importantly, getting back to the issue of what the biggest threat is, I think myself, having worked a little bit on this for over the years, is the Russia problem.
Yeah.
And we're trying to do obviously Nunn-Lugar and other efforts, and there are some proposals to intensify that. Do you have some specific ideas on how we can do that, if you would, to put the loose nukes into some better order? I don't believe that we can sit back confidently, since nothing happened, that there's no problem. Thank you.
Well, I absolutely agree with that last thing that you said. You provoke a bit of thinking on your first comment about having passed things on to the DOD. I think we do have to think more carefully about what the role of DOD is in a lot of these things domestically. No, and I don't mean that in a get DOD out of it way. I think you have a lot of cases where you may end up saying, DOD, please come and help us, and you haven't thought it through in advance. It's something to think through. The sort of macro long-term trajectory, I agree that over the long term you have certain declining barriers, broader education, broader communications, things like that. I don't think they're declining as quickly as a lot of people might imagine, again, because I think the value of information is overestimated. Someone said to me in one talk, they asked, well, but people can do sort of online collaboration, networking, and you still can't do an online collaboration actually building something. Okay? There's a big difference there. As far as sort of ultimate disarmament goes, I'm frankly I'm more interested in the short term of heading in that direction. I'm not quite so sure where exactly you want to end up, but I think a much broader group of people can agree on what way you want to start going. And I'll be self-promoting and recommend my first book with Mike O'Hanlon on the future of arms control, which talks a lot more in detail about that. I don't talk about that here. It's a broader context kind of thing. I'll use this as an opportunity to make one little comment, though. Be careful about how the long-term vision, may get in the way of the short-term action. And just give one really simple example. And I know it's a bit off the topic of the book, but it's come up twice, so I'll say this. Last time the CTB got defeated, and I'm a fan of the CTB, last time it got defeated, people said, you can't vote for this. They said a lot of things. One of the things they said was, you can't vote for this. This is the first step toward nuclear abolition. This is a stalking horse for nuclear abolition. People who support it said, no, this is just a concrete, immediate step in the national security interest. This time people will say the same thing, and they'll have a lot more evidence to back themselves up. Does that make the near-term steps more likely to succeed or less likely? I'm not sure. So I think we've got to be very careful about those sorts of things if you want to get the near-term steps through. And then on non-Lugar, I don't think we need any really new ideas. There's a lot that still needs to be done. There's a lot that's been accomplished. I mean, I don't think we should underestimate how much has been accomplished. And again, I would point to other people for new ideas there, because there are tons of people working on those sorts of things. I think you got no better place than Matt Bunn Company's annual study on these things. I don't think anyone's going to improve particularly on them except through actual action. And that means high-level attention. I think we're sort of up against the wall of what you can do by spending more money. And you need to break down barriers, and that takes really high-level commitment.
We're unfortunately out of time, but let's thank Michael for a really worthwhile presentation and discussion.
And just wanted to announce that our next meeting in the series will be held on April 11th, same time, noon to 1:30, and the speaker will be